Imagine this scene. The hot sun is scorching the sands of Egypt, and you are a Roman soldier, exhausted, dirty, with blisters on your feet that you have never seen before in your life. Suddenly, your commander says, "Today you will meet the most powerful woman in the world." You expect to see an old woman on a throne, dressed in gold and weary of life. But instead, there she is. A woman who sends shivers down your spine with a single glance. She speaks 9 languages, jokes with quotes from Aristotle, but at the same time can decide the fate of a legion with a single flick of her finger. I can make you emperor or wipe you out. You choose. That was Cleopatra Septemphila Ptolemea, not just the queen of Egypt, but the embodiment of power, intelligence, and calculation. She is often portrayed as a capricious seductress, but in reality, she was much more formidable, a strategist, scholar, diplomat, and flawless political chess player. For the ancient world, she was an institution unto herself, a library, an army, a brand, a myth, all rolled into one. And now, here's the first fact that turns the familiar picture upside down. Cleopatra was never an empress. Formally, she was only the queen of Egypt, but in reality, she ruled the richest empire in the Mediterranean. She managed the greatest library of antiquity, was knowledgeable in medicine, mathematics, and philosophy, and at the same time knew how to throw a party that would be talked about for centuries. And this is where it gets really interesting. When people say that Cleopatra used her charm, many immediately think of a banal stereotype. But she was not a frivolous seductress. She was a surgeon of power. All her external attractiveness was just one of many tools. Like a diplomat uses words, a general uses strategy, and she used every element, her voice, her intellect, her manner, with precise coldness and complete control. Now sit down. In her entire life, she had only 2 lovers. 2, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. But what lovers they were. These 2 alliances turned the history of the Western world upside down. Everything you know about the fall of the Roman Republic, the birth of the empire, the rise of Augustus, all of it is connected in one way or another to how Cleopatra played politics with her body and her mind. Each of her kisses was a step on the political map. Each of her glances could mean war or alliance. Can you imagine that every embrace decides the fate of millions? And here's what's really amazing. It worked. For almost 20 years, Egypt remained an economic giant. At a time when women in other countries did not even have the right to inherit property, Cleopatra stood alone against Rome. Could you rule an empire, command armies, maintain the economy, and at the same time play out complex diplomatic maneuvers in which one wrong word meant defeat? Cleopatra could. And that is why she went down in history not as a lover, but as a political genius. Deadly beautiful, frighteningly intelligent, she forever changed the perception of what a woman in power is capable of. Imagine waking up every morning thinking, today, everything depends on me. Your country, your people, your family. Everything depends on how smart, charming, and cold-blooded you can be. That's how Cleopatra lived. And she didn't just survive in that hell, she thrived. Today, we'll figure out how a 22-year-old girl became a nightmare for the entire Roman Republic, how she used her mind and charisma as weapons, and why her name is still remembered 2,000 years later. Ready? This isn't a fairy tale about a princess with a soft voice. This is the story of a woman who almost conquered the world with only her intellect, charm, and a clear understanding of power that would have made Machiavelli nervously smoke on the sidelines. Let's start with the myths. The first is the most persistent. Cleopatra was an incredible beauty. Alas, this is a lie. Roman sources, which, believe me, could not stand her, hardly mention her appearance. Instead, they write enthusiastically about her voice, intelligence, and attractiveness. The historian Plutarch said bluntly, "Her beauty was not exceptional, but conversation with her had an irresistible charm." You know, there are people like that. Ordinary in appearance. But once they start talking, you can't tear yourself away. That was Cleopatra. She was no Instagram diva or cover model. Her magic lay elsewhere, in her intelligence, confidence, and strength, and she knew exactly how to use it. The next myth, she was Egyptian. Not exactly. Cleopatra came from the Macedonian Ptolemaic dynasty, direct descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals. The Greeks, who ruled Egypt for over 300 years, didn't really try to get closer to the local people. During all that time, not one of them even tried to learn the Egyptian language. Not one. Except her. Cleopatra became the first ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty to speak to the people in their language. Just think about it. 3 centuries of rule, and only one woman found respect for her country. And that changed everything. She spoke to the people not as a foreigner, but as the mother of the nation. And in doing so, she earned what none of her predecessors had been able to achieve: the genuine love and devotion of the Egyptian people. By the way, few people know this, but she didn't just learn Egyptian. She spoke Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Aramaic, Ethiopian, the language of the troglodytes, and, according to some sources, at least 9 other languages. And this was at a time when most people could barely write their own names. Cleopatra was a walking encyclopedia. Just imagine. She was more educated than almost all Roman senators. And here's the third myth, the most offensive one: that she was just a seductress, another femme fatale with dark circles under her eyes. Nonsense. Cleopatra wasn't just smart. She was a genius. She studied at the Library of Alexandria, the largest center of knowledge of her time, and later became its director. Yes, a woman ran the greatest scientific institution of antiquity. She wrote works on medicine, cosmetics, and philosophy. She could talk for hours about Aristotle's rhetoric, discuss mathematics, or devise military strategies. And in the evening, she would host receptions, run the state, and at the same time remember everything, calculate everything, and keep everything under control. Her intellect was frightening. But do you know what really made her invincible? She understood what most modern politicians still do not realize. Perception is reality. Every public appearance was carefully choreographed. Every diplomatic appearance was a theatrical performance. In ancient times, appearances were just as important as substance. Cleopatra was a master at using images to influence perception. Remember how she first appeared before Mark Antony? Not on a simple boat. She arrived in a golden barge with silver oars and purple sails soaked in incense. She was dressed like the goddess Aphrodite. She was fanned by children dressed as cupids, and music rang out from the shore, making even the toughest soldiers' knees tremble. This was not just a show. It was a clear, well-thought-out political move. And it worked. At that moment, Mark Antony was no longer a military leader. He became her puppet, and the history of the West changed direction once again. Do you know why Cleopatra staged this whole spectacle with the golden bark and cupids? Because she understood male psychology better than any modern psychotherapist. Mark Antony was used to conquering cities, countries, and armies, but Cleopatra did everything she could to make him feel conquered from the very first second. It was a masterstroke. Steve Jobs' presentation of the new iPhone, only in 41 BC, and it worked perfectly. The general who had conquered half the world remained in Egypt for many months, completely enchanted. Rome was seething with anger. For the Romans, she was not just an inconvenient queen from the south. She embodied everything they feared. A woman who was intelligent, independent, rich, and influential. The very fact of her existence was a challenge. And what did they do when they talked about her? They came up with nicknames. The Eastern Witch, the Serpent of the Nile, the Egyptian Seductress. But notice, they never once called her stupid. They never dared to say she was weak, because they knew it was a lie. She was their nightmare. A woman who didn't need anyone's protection and certainly didn't need theirs. The fourth lie is that Cleopatra died for love. Come on, this isn't a romance novel, it's politics. She didn't kill herself because she was crying over Mark Antony's body, but because she lost the greatest civil war of her time. She knew she would be taken to Rome, paraded through the streets in chains, and made a living trophy. She refused that fate. She even planned her death like a strategist. No tears, no hysterics, just cold calculation. Hollywood sold us a fairy tale. History gives us a much harsher and much more interesting truth. So tell me, did you even know Cleopatra was like that? Not a pretty toy, but a brainy political monster who almost outplayed the whole of Rome? If this is news to you, hold on tight. This is just the beginning. It gets even more powerful. But to truly understand who Cleopatra was, you need to understand what Egypt was like in her time. And forget all those movies where Egypt is camels, pyramids, and hot sand. You wake up in Alexandria, 50 BC. You open your eyes, and the first thing you see is the lighthouse of Alexandria. One of the 7 wonders of the world, 130 meters high, taller than the Statue of Liberty. And it's not just architecture, it's a technological breakthrough. The lighthouse was equipped with mirrors that reflected sunlight for tens of kilometers. Ships could see it long before they reached the shore, as if it had a 21st century searchlight built into it. And that's just the beginning. All around were crowds of people from all over the world. Greeks, Romans, Jews, Nubians, Persians, Indians. They spoke dozens of languages. They traded goods from all corners of the earth. The smells, oriental spices, fragrant oils, incense, and of course sweat. The sweat of workers, sailors, merchants. But this is the smell of life, the smell of money. Because Egypt controlled the entire trade route between Asia and Europe. Silk from China, spices from India, gold from Africa. All of this passed through Egyptian ports. It was the ancient Suez Canal, only 1,000 times more important. And now imagine, she ruled over all of this. Cleopatra, a woman who held the economy of the entire ancient world in her hands. By modern standards, she had more power and wealth than Bezos, Musk, and Gates combined. She could buy any senator, bribe any army, sponsor any war. But instead, she decided to rule. And she almost won. Now, here's the key thing to understand. Back then, Egypt produced 1/3 of all the grain consumed by the Roman Empire. 1/3! Without Egyptian bread, Rome would have simply starved to death. Let me repeat that. The greatest military power of antiquity depended on Egypt to keep it from starving. Now it becomes clear why the Romans were so afraid of Cleopatra. They were not afraid of a woman. They were afraid of what she represented: independence, power, strength. But Egypt's wealth was not only gold and wheat. Egypt's real weapon was something else: knowledge. The Library of Alexandria was not just a place where scrolls were kept. It contained more than 400,000 papyri. All the knowledge of humanity at that time was in one place: mathematics, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, literature, engineering. If you wanted to learn something, you went to Alexandria. And Cleopatra didn't just rule this city. She was, in essence, the rector of the most advanced scientific center of her time. And it's important to understand that Cleopatra did not inherit a weak, depleted state. No. She inherited a perfectly tuned system that ran like clockwork. And you know what's amazing? She not only preserved it, but improved it. Under her rule, Egypt experienced the last golden age in its history. Temples were restored, new ports were built, trade was expanded, and agriculture was developed. All this was done with her personal involvement. She communicated with peasants in Egyptian, negotiated with merchants in Greek, and discussed philosophy with scholars in Latin. Her knowledge of languages was not a hobby, it was a tool of governance. But here's what's really impressive. She achieved all this as a woman in an era when women had almost no rights. In Rome, for example, a woman could not even be a witness in court. She belonged first to her father, then to her husband. And Cleopatra? She was the absolute ruler of the most powerful state in the Eastern Mediterranean. And the Romans understood this perfectly well. They knew that if they tried to conquer Egypt by force, it would be a disaster. First, Egypt had trade links with the entire civilized world. Second, any war in Egypt would mean the destruction of the economy that fed Rome itself. It would be like someone wanting to strike Silicon Valley today. Theoretically, it's possible, but it would result in a global economic crisis. That's why Rome preferred diplomacy. Not out of kindness, but out of fear, because it was safer and cheaper. Cleopatra understood this. She knew that Rome needed Egypt more than Egypt needed Rome, but she also understood that this was a temporary advantage. With each passing year, Rome grew stronger. Their legions multiplied, their economy grew, and the moment would come when Egypt would no longer be able to dictate terms. She sensed it, and that is why she began to develop a long-term strategy for staying in the game, how to preserve her country and her place in the world. Give yourself a second to grasp the scale of it. Did you know that Egypt was such an important link, that without it, Rome simply would not have survived? And Cleopatra controlled all of this, calmly, precisely, without hysterics. She managed the economy, diplomacy, science, education, and all this in a world where women weren't even allowed to speak in court. Now, do you understand why they feared her so much? Because in reality, they knew she was better. Imagine you have two strategies to subjugate a superpower. The first is invasion. You send hundreds of thousands of soldiers, spend untold riches, lose people, and in the end, you may destroy exactly what you wanted to capture. The second is to find a way to the leader, form an alliance, and get the same thing without firing a single shot. Which would you choose? The second, of course. It's cheaper, safer, and most importantly, smarter. And Cleopatra was a true master of this. There was just one important detail. She wasn't a seductress in the usual sense. No, she was a center of attraction around which the most powerful men of her time revolved. They sought her favor, not the other way around. She did not use her appearance as a last resort. She acted like a modern CEO. She managed all the resources of the empire, education, economy, culture, and yes, her natural charisma, with precision and calculation. Just as a designer transforms an aesthetic detail into the essence of a product, Cleopatra transformed her personal charm into part of her state strategy. But she did not rely on it. She always played with her mind. And then Julius Caesar appeared. The year was 48 BC. He arrived in Egypt in pursuit of his enemy, Gnaeus Pompeius. By this time, Cleopatra is already in danger. Her own brother, Ptolemy XIII, has exiled her from Alexandria and is trying to hold on to power. She has neither an army nor a throne. What does most people do in such a situation? They beg for help, offer gold, promise obedience. Cleopatra. She stages one of the most legendary episodes in the history of diplomacy. she orders herself to be wrapped in a carpet and delivered to Caesar's chambers as a gift. Imagine the scene. The most powerful man in Rome is sitting over maps, surrounded by legionaries and officials, and then a carpet is brought in. It is unrolled and a young woman emerges. But she is not just beautiful. She speaks Latin perfectly, instantly begins to discuss the internal situation in Egypt, and demonstrates such an understanding of political subtleties that Caesar, who has seen it all, is genuinely impressed. She did not fall at his feet. She showed that she was worthy of being an ally, not a subordinate. She was 22. He was 52. He had conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, and destroyed Pompey. And suddenly he meets a woman who can talk to him as an equal. For such a man, there is no greater respect than for someone who can challenge him intellectually. Their alliance became not only personal, but also political. Caesar needed Egypt's resources for his ambitions. Cleopatra needed Rome's protection to keep her power. They had a son, Caesarion. But even here, Cleopatra acted wisely. She never asked Caesar to marry her. Why? Because in marriage, she would have become one of Caesar's wives and lost her independence. By remaining unmarried, she retained Egypt's full sovereignty. Imagine, it's like forming a strategic alliance with America while remaining an independent state. All the benefits without losing control. Caesar spent several months in Egypt. Rumors began to spread in Rome that he was becoming Egyptianized. And you know what? There was some truth to that. Cleopatra impressed him so much that he began to adopt Egyptian practices. Many of the reforms he later introduced in Rome were inspired by the Egyptian system of government. Even the modern Julian calendar we still use today was based on the Egyptian calendar and was introduced after Cleopatra explained to him how the local calendar system worked. Can you imagine the scale of this? She didn't just convince Caesar that she was right. She influenced the culture of Rome. She showed that Egypt was not exotic, but a model of advanced civilization. She impressed him not with her appearance, but with her thinking. And that was a real victory. But then tragedy struck. In 44 BC, Caesar was assassinated. Cleopatra lost her protection. What did she do? She didn't panic. She didn't rush to find a new protector. She did what she always did best. She observed, analyzed, and waited. Because she understood that a new civil war was inevitable, and she had to choose whose side to take. When Mark Antony became one of the main leaders of the new triumvirate, Cleopatra made her next move. And this time, it was even more subtle and precise. Unlike Caesar, who valued intellect and conversation, Antony was a warrior. He was not impressed by words, but by spectacle. Not by philosophy, but by power. And Cleopatra knew this. So she didn't just show up for the meeting. She made a grand entrance that went down in history. In Tarsus, where she arrived at Antony's invitation, Cleopatra turned her arrival into a theatrical performance. Mark Antony expected the queen to appear in modest clothes, ready to beg for mercy. Instead, a goddess sailed up to him, literally. Her ship was transformed into a floating temple of Aphrodite, with purple sails, gold decorations, musicians, and fragrances wafting through the air. The wind blew the fabrics, and servants dressed as cupids danced on the deck. It was not just a scene, and it was a seizure of power without a single word. Antony was stunned. He canceled the reception that had been prepared in advance and went to Cleopatra's ship himself, on her terms, on her territory. And now she had shifted the balance again. Now it was no longer she who was asking. He had come to her. In one fell swoop, she had changed the balance of power. She showed that she did not need protection. She was offering a partnership, not a request, an alliance. It is important to understand that everything that happened next was not about feelings. It was calculation, strategy, great diplomacy. Their alliance was not a whim of lovers. It was an attempt to change the whole world. Mark Antony was far from naive. He was well aware of who he was dealing with. But what Cleopatra offered was stronger than any logic. She not only promised personal adoration, she offered power, wealth, and the opportunity to create an alternative to Rome. A real, full-fledged empire based not on fear, but on culture, prosperity, and knowledge. And then came the moment that almost changed the course of history. Together, Cleopatra and Mark Antony began to build a new concept of civilization, a Greco-Egyptian empire centered in Alexandria. Their plan? To create a dynasty that would rule from Spain to India, a new world order. The new capital would not be Rome, but Alexandria. Sounds like utopia. But they had all the resources to make it happen. Antony controlled the eastern part of the Roman Empire, Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and part of the Mediterranean. Cleopatra ruled Egypt, the main economic center of the ancient world, through which all the major trade routes passed. Together, they had more money than the rest of the world. They had experienced military leaders, advanced technology, and developed logistics. But most importantly, they had an idea. Cleopatra convinced Antony that Rome was heading toward a dead end. Rome was conquering by force and keeping its subjects in fear. She offered something different, conquering not with swords, but with culture. Not to keep people subjugated, but to engage them through mutual benefit. Not to destroy, but to build. And Antony began to change. He began to adopt Egyptian customs, wore the clothes of a pharaoh, and participated in rituals. He didn't just come to Cleopatra. He became part of her world. He saw an alternative to Rome and believed in it. Now imagine, if they had won, we would be living in a completely different world. We would speak Greek instead of languages based on Latin. Instead of Roman law, we would have a system based on Egyptian culture and Greek philosophy. Instead of the arches of the Colosseum, there would be endless libraries. Instead of an empire of the sword, we would have a civilization of the mind. This is not fantasy. This is what almost happened. That is why the story of Cleopatra is not a novel. It is a fork in the road, after which the world could have gone in a completely different direction. And for a moment, for just a few years, she held the direction of that path in her hands. Mark Antony immersed himself deeper and deeper into Egyptian culture. He participated in religious ceremonies, wore traditional clothing, and learned the basics of the Egyptian language. And in Rome, this caused outrage. The Romans believed he had gone mad, but the truth was different. He simply saw what Rome categorically refused to acknowledge. Egypt was culturally superior in many ways. While Rome built colosseums for mass entertainment and bloody spectacles, Egypt built libraries to educate the elite. While Rome conquered by force, Egypt prospered through trade, and all this was impressive. Cleopatra and Antony had 3 children, twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and later Ptolemy Philadelphus. And this is where the real symbolism begins. The names of their children were not just a matter of taste. They were political statements. Alexander Helios, Alexander the Sun, was a direct reference to Alexander the Great conqueror, and at the same time a promise. This child was to become the new conqueror of the world. Cleopatra Selene, Cleopatra the Moon, was a symbol of the feminine principle. Together, they represented the sun and the moon, male and female, east and west. It was a poetic formula for an imperial union. Our children will rule over all. And they didn't just talk about it, they demonstrated it. A grand ceremony was held in Alexandria, which went down in history as the Donations of Alexandria. Formally, it was a celebration. In reality, it was a direct political provocation. Cleopatra and Antony appeared as gods, he as Osiris and Dionysus, she as Isis and Aphrodite. Their children were presented as the rulers of the future empire. Caesarion, the son of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, was declared the legitimate heir to Caesar. This was a slap in the face to Octavian, who had built his entire influence on his status as Caesar's adopted son. Then came the most provocative move. Antony began to distribute territories as if he were already emperor of half the world. Armenia and Media went to Alexander Helios, Crete and Cyrenaica to Cleopatra Selene, Syria and Asia Minor to Ptolemy Philadelphus. To Rome, this looked like madness, but from their point of view, they were repeating the path of Alexander the Great. They were creating a new, multicultural empire that was supposed to be richer and more powerful than any state in history. The problem was that Rome was not going to allow this to happen. Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, instantly understood that what was at stake was not personal drama, but the survival of Rome. This was not just an alliance with the Queen of the East, it was the emergence of an alternative center of power, capable of challenging Rome itself. And so he did what Roman politicians always did best. He launched a devastating propaganda campaign. Rumors began to spread among the people that Cleopatra was a sorceress, that she had bewitched Antony, that she used dark potions and magic. But the main weapon turned out to be the image of an Eastern harlot. Octavian declared that Rome was at war not with Antony, but with Cleopatra. It was genius. He turned the Roman Civil War into a patriotic confrontation with an external threat. And the Romans, already prejudiced against women and foreigners, readily believed it. Mark Antony made the biggest mistake of his life. He tried to fight propaganda with facts. But in politics, perception always trumps truth. His arguments didn't work when caricatures were already circulating in the streets of Rome, mocking him as a puppet in the hands of an Eastern witch. Now imagine, if they had won, the world could have been different. We might be speaking Greek, studying in libraries instead of watching gladiator fights. Perhaps science would have advanced 1,000 years. This is no exaggeration. This is the fork in the road where humanity stopped. And the choice was not made by philosophers, scientists, or children. The choice was made by fear. And Cleopatra did not lose because she was weaker. She lost because her enemy was more cynical, more cunning, and knew how to control the crowd. From that moment on, everything changed. History took a turn where amphitheaters won, not knowledge. Politics won, not reason. Rome won, not Alexandria. The 2nd of September in the year 31 BC is the most important date in Western history, yet almost no one remembers it. It was on this day that the fate of the entire world was decided. Whether it would become Roman or Greco-Egyptian, whether its rulers would be called emperors or pharaohs, whether Rome or Alexandria would become the capital of civilization. It all came down to one battle, the naval battle of Actium. And Cleopatra and Mark Antony lost it not because of a lack of troops or strategy. The reason was much more human, a tragic misunderstanding. Imagine the scene. The sun-drenched Ionian Sea off the coast of western Greece. On one side is Octavian's fleet, 400 fast warships. On the other is the combined fleet of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, more than 500 ships, including 60 Egyptian warships financed by the queen herself. She was not just an ally. She was a woman who personally led the rear of the fleet, investing not only her army in the war, but also all her gold, her lands, her prestige, and the future of her children. Yes, let's repeat that out loud. In 31 BC, a woman commanded a fleet in the largest naval battle of the ancient world against the future emperor of Rome. For the Roman soldiers, it was humiliating. They were not just fighting against a traitorous compatriot. They were looking into the face of what they feared most, a foreign woman who dared to challenge the Roman Republic itself. The battle began early in the morning. Octavian's ships were more maneuverable, but inferior in size and firepower. The galleys of Antony and Cleopatra were huge and heavy, their archers and catapults sowing chaos. Even Greek fire was used in the battle, a deadly liquid that burned ships to the ground. The battle raged for hours. People rode until their hands were bloody and blistered. Arrows flew like clouds. The waters of the bay were stained with blood. And at the most tense moment, something happened that historians still debate today. Cleopatra, who was in the rear with 60 Egyptian ships, suddenly turned her fleet around and left. Without warning, without a signal, she simply turned around and left. Why? The Roman version, the one written by the victors over the centuries, claims that she chickened out. She abandoned Antony because she was afraid, and he ran after her in love. But this is a lie. Cleopatra had put everything into this battle: her throne, her country, the future of her children. She knew that defeat meant the end, and she was not a woman who would retreat without seeing things through to the end. Modern historians have reconstructed a much more logical version. Antony and Cleopatra had a plan. If the battle took a critical turn, Cleopatra was to lead her fleet with the treasury back to Egypt. Losing the fleet was terrible. Losing all funding for the war was fatal. But in ancient times, signals were transmitted in a primitive way: flags, smoke, trumpets. And in the chaos of battle, Cleopatra most likely misunderstood the signal. She took it as an order to retreat. When Antony saw the Egyptian ships leaving, he was faced with a choice: stay and fight without support, or try to preserve a chance to continue the war. He chose the latter. Strategically, it was wise. Psychologically, it was a disaster. His soldiers saw their commander leaving the battlefield and thought all was lost. Panic ensued. The fleet fell apart. Some captains continued to fight until evening, but without a single command center, it was no longer a battle, but a death wish. Octavian won. But not because he was better, and not because his army was stronger. He won because of one mistake, one misinterpreted signal, one wrong turn. It was not a great military victory. It was a combination of circumstances that forever determined the fate of our civilization. Just imagine how painful it must have been for Cleopatra. Years of preparation, millions of drachmas spent, political alliances, risking her life. Her whole world was at stake, and it all collapsed because of a misunderstanding that lasted less than half a minute. It's like losing the World Cup final because of a referee's mistake. Only here, losing meant losing control of the entire known civilization. After the operation, Cleopatra and Mark Antony returned to Egypt. They had 1 year to prepare their last line of defense, 1 year to try to change the course of the war, but something inside had already cracked. Antony fell into a deep depression. He blamed himself for believing the signal, for following Cleopatra, for losing the respect of his soldiers, and with it, himself. Cleopatra, however, did not allow herself to break down. She immediately sprang into action. She sent envoys to neighboring kingdoms in search of allies. She began recruiting new soldiers. She even seriously considered moving her court to India and building a new center for her empire there. This was a woman who did not have a give up button. But she understood that she could no longer rely on Antony. He was lost. He was weak. That meant she had to act on her own. And so she began to prepare a move that no one expected. A new, and perhaps the most daring, plan. Even after her defeat, Cleopatra remained true to herself. She always played to the end, and she still had cards up her sleeve, cards so strong that they could turn even a lost game around. she decided to enter into negotiations with Octavian himself. Wait, don't jump to conclusions. It wasn't humiliation, it was calculation. It was a move bordering on madness. But that's what made it genius. She had studied Octavian for years. She knew he was neither Caesar nor Antony. Caesar was a philosopher who admired intelligence. Antony was a military leader who was impressed by spectacle. And Octavian? Octavian was a pure politician. He was not interested in feelings. All he wanted was power, order, and control. He was cold as ice. He calculated everything. And Cleopatra understood. If you cannot defeat your enemy in battle, try to negotiate so that it is more advantageous for him to keep you alive. She began to send him messages, not requests or pleas, but offers. Offers that were difficult to refuse. Egypt would become Rome's breadbasket. She would be a vassal queen retaining power in name only. Her children would be rulers under Rome's control. In return, she would hand over Mark Antony. She would also help rule a country that Octavian did not understand. Just think about it. Even after her defeat, even after her entire fleet had been destroyed, she negotiated not as a defeated woman, but as an equal. Why? Because she had something Rome did not have: knowledge. Only she knew how to rule Egypt. Rome knew how to conquer, but it didn't always know how to hold on to what it had conquered. Octavian understood this, and this is where we see why Cleopatra was the most dangerous woman in the ancient world. Because even in the midst of total collapse, even when everything was against her, she remained a player. Confident, calculating, strategically strong. She didn't just survive. She continued to bargain, and she bargained from a position of power. The Egyptian system of government was incredibly complex. Agriculture, trade, religion, bureaucracy, all of these were intertwined, honed over centuries, and worked as a single living mechanism. Octavian could appoint Roman governors, but they did not speak Egyptian, did not understand local customs, did not know how to get along with the priests, and were unfamiliar with trade routes and religious rituals. Cleopatra offered him not just an alliance. She offered a gentle, manageable transformation of power. What Rome had always lacked after its conquests, not forceful control, but a smooth transition. And for a while, it seemed that it might work. Octavian began to respond to her messages. No promises, but no refusals either. He was considering his options. Imagine the atmosphere in Alexandria during those months. Antony, broken, drinks, and complains about life, while Cleopatra conducts secret correspondence with his mortal enemy. Was it betrayal? Was it a struggle for survival? Was it love for her children? Or was it the last gamble of a great player? Most likely it was all of the above. But then Antony finds out. History is silent on the details. But when he realized that Cleopatra was negotiating with Octavian, he took it as a betrayal, not just a personal one. For him, it meant that she was confirming all of Rome's accusations that she was a manipulator who would switch from one man to another for personal gain. They came face to face, and perhaps the most brutal argument in ancient history ensued. Antony accused Cleopatra of everything the Romans had said about her, of lying, of ambition, of being willing to sacrifice everything for her own gain. She replied simply, "If you cannot win the war, let me try to win the peace." She did not ask for forgiveness. She defended her right to fight to the end, by any means necessary. It was a conflict not only between two people, but between two approaches to power. Antony believed in military honor, death on the battlefield, and glory. Cleopatra believed in survival, flexibility, and preserving her country and her children's future. One believed that it was better to die than to surrender. The other believed that a ruler must seek any means to save his people, even the most unpleasant ones. Who was right? It all depends on your point of view. If you look through the prism of ideals, it was Antony. If you look through the prism of real responsibility, it was Cleopatra. But one thing is clear. This conflict destroyed Egypt's last chance for an organized defense. Antony left Alexandria, settled alone on an island, and renounced his command. Cleopatra remained alone, and she waited. Octavian approached Alexandria in the summer of 30th BC. He found a kingdom in ruins, Antony, disappointed and depressed, and Cleopatra still trying to bargain. It was the moment of truth. Would he accept her offer? Would he see her as an ally or a threat? This choice determined not only the fate of a woman, it determined the fate of Western civilization as a whole. Decide for yourself. Did she betray Antony, or was she trying to save her country? What would you have done if your children, your country, your people were at stake? But what happened next was not the tragic death of a queen in the spirit of poetry. It was the last, precise, and well-thought-out action of a woman who knew how to play politics, even at the very edge. With her death, she put an end to it all, but she did so in such a way that she will be remembered forever. Cleopatra did not go down defeated, but as a strategist who, even in defeat, retained her dignity and power until the very last second. When Octavian entered Alexandria, Cleopatra did not flee, did not hide in the dungeons, did not beg for mercy. She locked herself in her own mausoleum, surrounded by her most precious treasures. It was not a gesture of despair. It was a position. The last, but still strong. Her gamble was simple. Octavian needed her alive. If Cleopatra died, she would become a martyr. If she killed herself, her death would become a symbol of resistance to Rome. But if he captured her alive, he could parade her through the streets of Rome in chains and turn her into the embodiment of Roman victory. And Cleopatra understood this perfectly well. From her mausoleum, she continued to negotiate, coldly, precisely, strategically. Leave Egypt to me, and I will be your loyal ally. Allow my children to inherit the throne, and the Ptolemaic dynasty will become your instrument of influence. I am the only one who can rule this country so that it works for Rome. Octavian listened but made no promises. He was playing too. He was stalling for time, wanting to tip the scales in his favor without a fight. And then tragedy struck. Rumors reach Antony that Cleopatra has committed suicide. In his broken state, he does not check. He simply believes. And driven by pain and grief, he decides on the last resort. He tries to kill himself by throwing himself on his own sword. But, as in the battles of recent years, even here he is unlucky. He does not die immediately. Badly wounded and bleeding to death, he learns that Cleopatra is alive. He is asked to be taken to the mausoleum. He wants to die in her arms. It is a scene that cannot be forgotten. The great Roman commander, humiliated, defeated, mortally wounded, dies in the arms of the woman with whom he challenged the whole world. This is not just love. It is the end of an era. But even at this moment, when tears and blood mix on the marble walls of the tomb, Cleopatra does not lose her clarity. She continues to think. She has not yet finished the game. After Antony's death, she sends Octavian a final message, but it is no longer a proposal. It is an ultimatum. If you do not allow me to die with dignity, I will destroy all the treasures of Egypt. You will get ashes instead of gold. It was her last brilliant bluff, and Octavian believed her, because he knew that if Cleopatra burned the royal gold, his reign would begin with economic collapse. The gold of Egypt was necessary to keep Rome afloat. He rushes to her. He wanted to negotiate in person. And then history took an unexpected turn. When he finally met Cleopatra, he was struck by her beauty. Even defeated, even tired, even at the age of 39, she was still irresistible. Historians who hated her admitted that it was impossible to remain indifferent to her. They talked for hours about history, philosophy, how Egypt was organized. She explained how to rule a multinational empire, how to combine the traditions of the East with the discipline of Rome. And for a moment, Octavian seriously considered, maybe she really deserved a chance? But then his advisors reminded him, this woman had already subjugated Caesar. She had already changed Antony's fate. Was he willing to risk the same? To become the third? Octavian made his decision. He lied to Cleopatra. He promises that she will retain her dignity, her children will be safe, and her title will remain. But he is already secretly preparing her for her fate as a trophy. He wants to parade her in chains through the streets of Rome, show her to the crowd as a fallen queen, as proof that Rome has won. But Cleopatra is too clever. She sees through the lies, she understands everything, and she makes her final conscious decision. That same night, she orders a basket of figs to be brought to her. But something else is hidden among the fruit. An Egyptian cobra, the symbol of pharaonic power, the symbol of the goddess Wadjet, protector of kings. Why a snake? Because for the Egyptians, to die from a cobra bite is to become a god. It was the most dignified death for a true ruler, and Cleopatra leaves not defeated, but exalted. Her death is not despair, but choice. The last move that deprives Octavian of his triumph. He gets the gold, but loses the spectacle. He gains power, but does not break her will, because Cleopatra left on her own terms. And she went down in history not as the mistress of great men, but as the greatest woman of her time. Cleopatra put on her finest royal clothes. She placed the crown on her head. She sat on the throne, and she allowed herself to be bitten by a cobra. She died as she had lived, in complete control of the situation. It was not an escape. It was a choice. The last word in a game where all the moves had already been made. And here's the paradox. Her death became her last and most resounding victory. Octavian dreamed of bringing her alive to Rome, to parade her in chains through the streets as a symbol of Egypt's fall. In the end, he got only her body, silent, majestic. He wanted to destroy the myth, but he created a legend. He wanted to prove Rome's superiority, but ended up losing the main battle, the battle for memory. He was left with a victory on paper, but he lost forever. Cleopatra became a symbol. Her death inspired rebellions, plays, paintings, and poems. The legend of the queen who chose death over humiliation has survived the centuries. She did not disappear. She rose above. But what about her children? Caesarion, the son of Cleopatra, and Julius Caesar, was killed on the orders of Octavian. He could not allow Caesar's legitimate heir to walk the earth. It was politics, cold-blooded and ruthless. Octavian took the rest of the children, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and the younger Ptolemy, with him to Rome. He paraded them publicly through the triumphal arch and then adopted them, just as cold-bloodedly. They were raised as Romans. Cleopatra Selene later married the ruler of Mauritania and became queen by right. Even after Cleopatra's death, her blood remained on the throne. Do you understand? She did not know how to lose completely. Even her defeats remained partial victories. Even her downfall was not complete. She always retained at least some control, even in death. Ask yourself, was she right to choose death? Was it worth trying to survive in Rome? Some would say yes, life is more important, but she knew that by allowing Rome to turn her into a trophy, she would have lost everything. She would have become a symbol of a conquered queen forever. Instead, she became a symbol of strength. But the important thing is not how she died. The important thing is why we still talk about her. More than 2,000 years have passed, and Cleopatra's name still lives on. Why? Not because of her beauty. Her appearance is a matter of debate. It's not because of her love affairs. She only had 2. We remember her because she was something that didn't exist before her and is still so rare today. She was a woman who didn't let the world tell her who she should be. Think about it. We live in the 21st century, and we're still debating whether a woman can be president, CEO, or general. Cleopatra dealt with these issues 2 millennia before us. How to be a mother without appearing weak. How to be intelligent without scaring off allies. How to rule an empire and not let men use your power against you. Questions that Caesar and Antony never asked themselves. They could be cruel, sentimental, angry, and still be respected. Cleopatra had to be perfect, always, and that's the most offensive thing. For centuries, male historians reduced her image to that of a seductress. They ignored her reforms, her politics, her strategies. They turned her into a woman who supposedly destroyed 2 great men. But listen, if you claim that Caesar and Mark Antony were brilliant military leaders and at the same time believe that Cleopatra ruined them simply with her looks, then you are calling these men weak. The truth is different. They knew who they were choosing, and they chose her because she was smarter, richer, more educated, and more far-sighted than all the others. She was their equal, and they recognized that. The world still cannot. They were not seduced. They were convinced. And you know what's most striking? Cleopatra almost won. If not for that fateful mistake at Actium, if Mark Antony hadn't lost heart, if Octavian had been a little less paranoid, we would be living in a completely different world, a world where knowledge would be valued above war, where the Library of Alexandria would not have been reduced to ashes, but would have become the heart of world science, where cultural diversity would be seen as a strength, not a threat. Was Cleopatra perfect? Of course not. She could be harsh, manipulative, strategically ruthless. She probably ordered the execution of her own brothers to protect the throne. But now compare that to her contemporaries. Julius Caesar slaughtered over 1 million Gauls. Octavian executed thousands of political opponents. Antony ordered entire villages to be crucified. They ruled through fear. Cleopatra ruled through reason, through alliances, through calculation, through negotiation. So, which of them was truly civilized? And this is where the great irony begins. Rome wanted to destroy her image, but it was Roman propaganda that made her immortal. They tried so hard to portray her as a demonic seductress that they turned her into a symbol of female power. They called her an Eastern threat, and thus turned her into a banner for the struggle against Western oppression. They condemned her for her choice of partners, and unwittingly proclaimed her a heroine of female autonomy. Rome won the war, but Cleopatra won eternity. Today, when a woman holds a high position, she is called overly ambitious. When she uses her charm along with her intelligence, she is said to be manipulative. When she has many connections, she is condemned more harshly than a man in the same situation. And she went through all of this 2,000 years ago. And do you know what she did in response? She continued to do her thing. She didn't make excuses. She didn't smooth things over. She simply did whatever was necessary to protect her people, her country, her power. This makes her one of the first, albeit unwitting, figures of feminism in history. She may not have known the word, but she knew for sure that no one would give you power. You have to take it. And you don't have to be perfect. You have to be strong. You have to be smart. You have to be someone the whole world can't ignore. That's why Cleopatra is still relevant today, not because she was a saint, but because she refused to be small, not because she was just beautiful. It's because she proved that intelligence plus willpower can change the course of history, even when the whole world is against you. Imagine if Cleopatra were born today, a billionaire who speaks 10 languages, a doctor of science from Harvard and Oxford, the head of a multinational corporation, a woman capable of convincing anyone at the negotiating table. How would she be treated today? Would she be respected? Or would she still be criticized for her strength, her charisma, for being too much? But that's not even the point. The question is not whether Cleopatra was good or bad. The question is, what can we learn from her? From a woman who became the most powerful figure of her era, in a world created for her to remain silent. And that, my friends, is where this crazy, amazing, and still living story ends. The story of a woman who, despite everything, refused to be a shadow. And that is why her name will never disappear. Let's be honest. If Cleopatra were alive today, we would both admire and envy her. She would be praised for her success and immediately condemned for her excessive ambition. She would be respected for her intelligence and at the same time doubted for her sincerity. She would be recognized as strong, and her personal life would be constantly scrutinized. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Because in fact, Cleopatra still makes us feel the same discomfort she made the Romans feel. She reminds us that strength has no gender, the mind knows no boundaries, and that one determined woman can change the entire course of history. But perhaps the main lesson she left behind is that she didn't wait for permission to be strong. In an era when women were considered property, she became the ruler of a great empire. In a world where women were forbidden from participating in politics, she redefined what politics meant. In a culture where women were valued for their ability to bear children, she showed that women could rule. She did not complain about injustice. She simply won within that very injustice. Was it easy? Never. She had to be smarter, more educated, more charismatic, and more far-sighted than any man in her position. Where men were forgiven for mediocrity, she had to be flawless. But she didn't use that as an excuse to give up. She used it as fuel. And you know what's truly inspiring? She never complained. She never blamed men. She never played the victim. She just did everything she could to win. That doesn't mean every woman should follow her path. Times are different. Rules are different. Opportunities are different. But her attitude is something worth learning. Power isn't asked for. It's taken. Mediocrity isn't an option. And if the world isn't ready to accept what you have to offer, that's the world's problem, not yours. Cleopatra understood what humanity is still struggling with. Being a woman is not a flaw. It's just a different point of view. It can be just as powerful, just as valuable, just as reality-changing. True strength does not limit, it unites. Remember what that video was called? Nymphomaniac in a Crown. And here, it all depends on what we mean by that word. If you think it's just a woman obsessed with intimacy, then no. Cleopatra had only 2 serious relationships in her entire life. But if you mean a woman who knew how to use emotions, desires, charm, and relationships as part of her strategy, then yes. But it's much more honest to call her something else. She was a woman who refused to choose. She didn't need to be either smart or beautiful. She was both. Not mother or ruler. She was both. She didn't need to give up her femininity to be a leader. That's why, 2,000 years later, we're still talking about her, making movies, writing books, arguing, because she embodies the main question that humanity has yet to answer. What happens when a woman has access to her full potential? And if Cleopatra's story teaches us anything, it is that such a woman can change the very essence of the world. So the next time someone tells you that you can't do something because you are a woman, remember her. When someone tries to limit you in any way, remember how one woman ruled the richest country in the world, spoke to emperors as an equal, and almost rewrote the history of civilization. This is Cleopatra, not a myth, a reminder of what a woman is capable of when she is not held back. The next time you feel like you have to choose between respect and love, between intelligence and appearance, between success and sincerity, remember Cleopatra. She refused to make these false choices. She did not divide herself into parts. She did not give up anything that was her strength, because that is the true essence of her lesson. She wasn't an empress. She wasn't a nymphomaniac. She wasn't a saint. She wasn't a demon. She was a woman who refused to be less than she could be. And that, even after 2,000 years, remains truly revolutionary. So ask yourself, what part of her story will you take with you? Is there a dream you've put off because it seemed too ambitious? Is there potential in you that you're hiding because the world isn't ready to accept it? If this story has changed your attitude toward power, ambition, and success, remember one simple phrase: the world will never be ready for what you have to offer. And that's okay. Offer it anyway. Fight your way through. Keep moving. Don't apologize. Don't wait for permission. Take action. Because that's exactly what Cleopatra did, and that's why she changed the world. Not in spite of her limitations, but because of how she dealt with them. See you soon, friend. I have many more stories like this, about people who didn't just accept a challenge, but turned it into their strength. And remember, you don't have to be perfect. You have to be brave.